Welcome to Birthright, a podcast about joy and healing in Black birth.
That's a wonderful question. Where has the joy existed? What has the joy been? I don't do a history that's a happy history, right? I'm writing about slavery. I'm writing about illnesses. So I'm writing about people at their most vulnerable. And I'm also using sources that were written by white men who owned Black people. And so it can sometimes be really hard to find, joy. What is the joyful experience of someone living in a state of chattel slavery? However, glimpses of humanity and joy and community come out. So, for instance, I often tell the story in my book of an enslaved woman named Nanny. In fact, there are two, but Nanny is one that sticks out for me. She had given birth a few times. She was really ill. And so anyway, her owner finds out about her illness about a year after she had been having some symptoms. And he calls in a doctor, and the doctor has to take notes. He's asking questions. And what's interesting in his notes, he just kind of says, the other slaves, or whatever word he used, commented that she was fragile because she bred a lot. And then he wrote some other things. And for me, it was this moment of, oh my God, how loved must Nanny have been for these enslaved people to insert themselves. And Black folk didn't approach white folk, right? So here they are, owned, and they cared so much about him getting the story, the medical history of Nanny correct, but choosing language that portrayed her as vulnerable and fragile and presenting nuance. And so for him, he's just writing notes in a case book. This is what the darkies told me, blah, blah, blah. But for me, having them as my focus, my Lord, this woman's community, they told him so much. She was a mother of 5 children. She had a number of pregnancies. This is why she's sick. I mean, all of these kinds of things. So Nanny eventually dies, unfortunately. But there's this moment where you saw a community rallying around her and speaking about her as a 3-dimensional human being, showing that they loved her and they cared for her. And that was wonderful for me. Another story about joy that involves children. Children are really the ones who give this formerly enslaved woman and her husband joy. She used to be called Nor, and then she was enslaved in Virginia. In fact, she was named after the town where she was enslaved, Norfolk. And she gives one of the very rare slave oral histories in the 1930s about her time in slavery. And she mentions that she had this really sick, sadistic owner who tended to make his slaves engage in orgies in front of him and his friends. And if they didn't get pregnant, he would do all kinds of even more horrible things. And so she said she was basically placed with this man named Sam, who was considered like this buck, right? And so they were forced to have sex in front of her owner and his friend, his friends. And so anyway, she says, thankfully, she became pregnant. And then they were made to marry, not legally, but kind of forced to be together. And she said she learned to love him, because this is the thing too. Sam was also a victim. So They learned to love each other. And she said they had these fine, healthy, big babies. And after slavery, they changed their names, and it was just, she just talked about how nice, how gentle, how loving Sam was to her. And they were so proud of their children, right? That even in the midst of being forced to mate like animals, this woman was able, she and Sam were able, as victims of trauma, to lean on each other and build a family and, talk about these fine, beautiful babies that they had. And it was just so loving for me to see how they made it over and how they built, despite all the odds, even after slavery, they built this family where their children just gave them so much joy, but also that she was able to call this man out. Like she called his name, and that rarely happened, but she was like, she wanted us to know that in fact, she might have been the object, right? She might have had the legal description of chattel property, movable property, but he was the one who was inhumane. He was the one who was, animalistic. And she and Sam found their humanity in each other and with their children. And so, wow, even though I don't write about happy things, those snatches of Black love and humanity and joy are the things that sustain me to continue telling these kinds of stories.
Yeah, I mean, I just love that. I've got goosebumps, Dr. Cooper Owens. And I think that we always find a way, right? Like from your first story, we always see each other when nobody else sees us, right?
Yeah.
And from your second story, we always find a way. And I think that's the point. Like, even in the most, oppressive and horrible and inhumane circumstances, it is something in the nature of us to always find a way, right? To find joy, create it ourselves, manufacture it like something. And I think that is, something in many ways that is unique to Black people because of our history in this country, right?
Yeah.
How do you maintain your joy doing all this negative medical history?
And believe it or not, I laugh a lot. Like I'm known as the silly one of my friends. So I laugh a lot. I have, at the beginning, your producer was like, "Oh, what beautiful plates." I surround myself with like beautiful Black art. Those are plates on my wall by Kehinde Wiley. I do a lot of exercise, like a lot of body work, and I take dance classes, and I do so with Black women who own these studios. I used to live in Brooklyn, so I still, virtually go to my exercise classes, even though I'm in Nebraska. So I do those kinds of things. I look at just stupid stuff on TV. I mean, really dumb. My husband is like, have your taste evolved since the 1970s? Because if it's like Jamie Foxx or Sanford and Son or Good Times, I'm like, I'm there. So I just want to look at things that, remind me of my childhood, that make me laugh, where I can see Black people, despite all of the, the think pieces we've had on media images, there is still something for me wonderful about shows where I'm looking at Black families. So Sanford and Son is about a father and a son, and Jamie Foxx about a nephew who moves in with his surrogate parents, who is aunt and uncle, and all kinds of shenanigans ensue. Or Good Times, they weren't always that good, but it was still a family dynamic, and I think there's something about that. Even in the midst of even the most foolish episodes, I'm seeing things that make me laugh and that are familiar and nostalgic, and so those are the things that sustain me.
Yeah, I love that. Dr. Cooper Owens, I close every episode by asking this question, and I'm curious about this from your perspective, particularly since you have such a history of what's happened to us in birth in this country. But the question is, what is our birthright? As you see it, based on your history, your perspective, and also your view as a Black woman yourself, what is our birthright?
Our birthright is to have the best quality of life and care that we can, in whatever ways we define it. There are some things that for me are universal. I think we should have universal, equitable healthcare, so that people live without complications that are unnecessary, that could have been prevented. But I also want us to live in joy. So whether it is naming your child something that is unique or joyous or connects you to a familial past, I want our families to continue to be tools of community uplift, models of excellence. And I don't mean that in a kind of politics or respectability way, but models of excellence where kinship and community is important. I want birth to be thought of as not a distressing emergency situation, but just the continuation of life through a biological function, right? That most human beings are capable of having. And so those are the things that I would say, not just one, but those are the things that are our birthright.
I love it.
Mhm.
Thank you for sharing.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for asking.